My name is Chip Gibbons. I'm the Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent. On my right is Jennifer Robinson. She's a human rights attorney. On my left is Jody Ginsburg, CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists. And on my far left, geographically, of course, is Agnes Callamard, Secretary General of Amnesty International. Defending Rights and Dissent first warned people about the First Amendment implications of charging Assange and WikiLeaks under the Espionage Act in December 2010. Here we are in February 2024, almost 14 years later, and our worst fears have come to light. I want to point out, before I let these distinguished guests speak, that nearly every civil liberties, press freedom, and human rights group have opposed this prosecution. All three of the groups on this stage, along with the ACLU, Freedom of the Press Foundation, and Reporters Without Borders, have sent, I believe it's 3 letters now, to the DOJ asking them to drop these charges. The editors and publishers of the New York Times, The Guardian, and many European newspapers have also called on the charges to be dropped, writing to the Justice Department in an open letter. This indictment sets a dangerous precedent and threatens to undermine America's First Amendment and the freedom of the press. Publishing is not a crime. Recently, 35 prominent First Amendment professors have also called for this case to be dropped. Representative Jim McGovern, who I want to thank for getting us this room, along with Thomas Macy, sent a letter to President Biden, and Representative Tlaib, whose staff is, I'm excited, with us today, also led a letter to Merrick Garland. So pretty much everyone who cares about, and the government of Australia, both parties have said it's time to bring this prosecution to a halt. So pretty much everyone who cares about press freedom has urged the Department of Justice to stop what they're doing, and we also have an international component. I mentioned that the Australian Prime Minister, as well as the opposition party, have said enough is enough. And I was recently in London for the extradition hearing, and I was surprised that pretty much everyone I talked to, from cab drivers to hotel desk clerks, were all aware of this case. I don't think we realize this in Washington, but the world is watching what we are doing, and they do not like what they are seeing at all. So I want to start with Jen. What exactly is Julian Assange charged with, both in terms of the criminal indictments and the publications he's charged for?
Sure. Well, thank you, Chip, and thank you, everyone, for being here. It's wonderful to share a podium or a panel with these distinguished women and women who have worked with over many years on press freedom issues. So thank you both, Jody and Agnes, for coming. Julian faces 18 different charges, 17 under the Espionage Act, 1 for computer intrusion. But all of these charges all relate to receipt, possession, and publication of national defence information. And when we talk about the publications themselves, it relates to the Guantanamo Bay files, collateral murder, the video and rules of engagement information that was published by WikiLeaks, which showed US forces shooting down civilians and journalists in Iraq, the Iraq and Afghan war logs, and the US diplomatic cables. So these are publications for which Julian's won journalism awards the world over, and he's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize every year since the publications back in 2010 and 2011. For those publications, he faces, under this indictment, he faces 175 years in prison. Chip gave you a very punchy outline of some of the key points I think that we need to touch upon today, but just to make clear that all of mainstream media organisations, including WikiLeaks partners in publishing this material, The Guardian, New York Times, Le Monde, El País, and Der Spiegel, The Washington Post, have all said that this is criminalizing journalistic activity. There's been a lot of debates about whether Julian is or is not a journalist, and for the lawyers in the room, you understand that this is a completely moot point. The First Amendment protects journalistic activity. It is not defined by the individual, it is defined by their acts. And engaging in journalistic activity is exactly what WikiLeaks and what Julian Assange did and what he stands accused of. That's why we talk about the New York Times problem. So the Obama administration chose not to prosecute this case because of the so-called New York Times problem, which is precisely this. You cannot distinguish between the journalistic activity that Julian engaged in, which he stands accused of in this case, and for that which he's being prosecuted, and what the New York Times does every day. So this is criminalizing journalism in the United States.
Thank you. And then Jody, I want to go to you. When we talk about these revelations the collateral murder video, the Iraq and Afghan war logs, the Guantanamo files, and then Cablegate. Were they really newsworthy revelations? Was there a public interest to publishing them?
Absolutely, they were newsworthy revelations, and I think the fact that they were published in 5 and more of the leading international news outlets around the world demonstrates that. I just want to say a little bit from a personal perspective. You asked me to talk about whether they were of public interest, and public interest is often one of these things that can feel difficult to understand. In 2007, I was working as a Reuters journalist, or I worked for Reuters, and 2 of those individuals who were killed in the US Apache helicopter shooting were Reuters journalists, and I cannot tell you what it feels like to watch 2 of your colleagues being murdered on a video. Not just killed or attacked once, but in the case of Saeed, attacked, wounded. Someone came to pick him up in a van. It was a dad with his 2 kids in the car on the way to school who stopped to pick up a wounded man, and the US fired again and killed Saeed. If that doesn't tell you that that's a public interest story, I don't know what does. Those are the stories, one of the stories that came out of the WikiLeaks leaks. There's absolutely a public interest, but more importantly, this case is crucial for press freedom in this country. The US prides itself on the First Amendment. The US holds itself up as the defender, the global defender of a free press, and yet here we have a case in which an individual risks over 100 years in jail for doing, as Jen said, exactly the kind of work that we expect of journalists, the kind of work that Daniel Ellsberg was engaged in when he exposed US activities in Vietnam, or when we heard of illegal activities undertaken by the US in propping up right-wing regimes in Latin America. We rely on this kind of activity, the obtaining of information that governments would rather keep secret, to be able to make made public, so that we, the public, can know what governments are doing supposedly in our name. The information that Julian was responsible for publishing shows evidence of US state criminality and human rights abuses. That is in the public interest. And if he is extradited, and if he is charged, and if he does go to prison, then every journalist doing this work, not just in the US, but across the world. Remember, he's not a US citizen. Julian is an Australian citizen who is currently sitting in a maximum security jail in the UK, and if he can be extradited back to the US, charged and put in jail under this crime, then any journalist anywhere can be charged and jailed for doing the kind of work that we expect journalists to do every day.
In a moment, I want to go more to the precedent that this case will set. But before I do that, Agnes, we've heard a lot about how these revelations exposed state criminality, exposed human rights abuses, and their significance for journalism. What's the significance of these types of revelations for human rights advocates and human rights groups?
Thank you very much. I think Jody has already highlighted the fact that the revelation that came out of those WikiLeaks documents confirmed what many human rights organizations had argued or sought to demonstrate, which was that war crimes were being committed by the US Army in Afghanistan or in Iraq. In Afghanistan, the WikiLeaks documents demonstrated that there was no real attempt to account for civilian killings, for instance, which was for Amnesty International an important issue. There was evidence related to the airstrike in Kunduz, which also highlighted numerous civilian deaths. On Iraq, the WikiLeaks released lots of documents which present the most comprehensive and detailed account of any war ever to have entered the public record, and of how the war has been conducted, the failure to address human rights violations, who was contracted to fight in Iraq, and so on and so forth. I want to add a personal story as well, which may not be of the same nature, but I happen to have worked extensively on Tunisia at the time of the Arab Spring, and I can tell you that some of the WikiLeaks information related to the dictator, Tunisian dictator at the time, was always mentioned to me by those activists who started the Arab Spring in Tunisia as being one of the factors that really compelled them to take to the street and to demand freedom and democracy.
Well, it sounds like these revelations were of great public interest, of great interest to journalists, of great interest to human rights organizations, of great interest to everyone in this country and around the world. So Jody, I know Jen touched on this in her remarks, but what precedent will be set if Julian Assange is convicted under the Espionage Act for journalists in this country and around the world?
So the precedent that it will set is that anyone who receives leaked information and then arranges its publication effectively could be charged and jailed. And all around the world, all of the time, journalists are receiving leaked information that governments would prepare to keep secret. You know, there is a reason why the US government did not want information leaking out, and it's not to do with the fact that it puts, the argument that's put forward, and Jen could talk about more about this, is that it put people in danger, but realistically the reason that most governments want to keep these things secret is also to cover up wrongdoing. That's the case in countries all over the world, and we've seen it time and time again that a lot of the reason for suppressing this information is because it demonstrates that governments are engaging in war crimes, engaging in human rights abuses, as we saw in these cases. So the implications are not just for US journalists, and this is what we heard about as the New York Times problem. In other words, this is the kind of thing that journalists do every day in the public interest. That's the fundamental work of journalism, is to expose wrongdoing and bring these incidents into the light. But it's much wider than that, because it doesn't just apply to US journalists, it applies to any journalist who may get information leaked to them about US government secrets, and if they have an extradition treaty with the US, they can be brought and tried and jailed in the US.
Jen, you represented Assange since 2010, but you have a number of press freedom clients around the world, including in cases where the US government actually agrees with your position. If Assange is convicted in this country, what is the impact for your other clients? Do you see other governments citing this precedent, or have they already even done so?
This case and the prosecution itself, let alone whether Julian is actually extradited and faces trial here, is already having a chilling effect globally, as Jody said, on journalism, on national security journalism, but it's being used and cited by different countries to justify their own prosecution under espionage or treason-like statutes. So the most key example that I use is Evan Gershkovich. So we have a Wall Street Journal journalist who's in prison in Russia on espionage charges. The US is seeking to have him released, and is calling on Russia for his release, saying it's quite right. And I agree with the US government. It is wrong to prosecute a journalist under espionage laws, but that is precisely what the US is doing in Julian Assange's case. And so it's unsurprising that you have Russian officials saying that don't talk to us about press freedom when you've got Julian Assange in prison. We've seen the president of Azerbaijan interviewed by the BBC about press freedom concerns. Same response. Do not even raise free speech with me while you've got Julian Assange in prison. So this is being used as a precedent by other regimes, China included. China, Russia, Azerbaijan, regimes like this are referencing Julian's case to justify what they're doing in their own jurisdictions. It is diminishing the moral authority of the United States and other democratic countries, Australia and the UK, to raise free speech concerns with these countries, and that's a problem. In our global advocacy, that is a problem. But beyond that, prosecuting someone for releasing this information as a human rights lawyer who has used WikiLeaks material in international courts, and we're seeing this material used in international courts. We've seen WikiLeaks material used in the European Court of Human Rights in relation to rendition and torture. We've seen it used in the Pakistani courts on US drone strikes, extrajudicial killings, which resulted in holding those to account and actually putting an end to drone strikes, at least for a period in Pakistan. We cited WikiLeaks material in the International Court of Justice in the Chagos Islands case, which resulted in the court finding that the UK is unlawfully occupying the Chagos Islands and must return them to Mauritius. So WikiLeaks material is having this immense impact for human rights advocacy the world over, in courts the world over, and yet we're prosecuting the person who effectively made this material available to us. That is a dangerous precedent, not just for journalism, but for human rights accountability the world over. And I think we're seeing it happen everywhere. Australia is starting to use national security legislation to use it to raid the ABC, and I think this is picking up and running with the precedent that the United States is setting in Julian's case.
And there was a case in Turkey too.
Yes, the journalist of Can Dündar. He is a Turkish journalist who was prosecuted and imprisoned. In fact, Biden, before he was president, intervened in that case to help to get Can Dündar released. The Turkish government at that time raised the fact of Julian Assange's ongoing incarceration to justify why they had Can Dündar in prison. So we see this all over the world. And I think it's really important that the US, I mean, I'm a comparative free speech lawyer. I admire the First Amendment. You should be proud of the First Amendment and to protect it. And this case is galling it, is cutting it about, and it's not. And I'm not the first person to say this is potentially the most dangerous incursion in free speech of our generation. This prosecution, the Press Freedom Foundation has been saying it, the most terrifying threat to the First Amendment. And your First Amendment is important. And the role that the United States plays globally in standing up for free speech is important. And this case is getting in the way.
And Can Dündar, the Turkish journalist, he was present at Julian's last hearing in London. He was at, I think, both days of the hearing, as well as at a panel you were at the night before, where he expressed bewilderment that Vice President Biden could campaign for his release and President Biden could carry on this prosecution.
Well, I think it's really important to remember that this is a prosecution that was commenced under the Trump administration, under President Trump, who was calling the media the enemy of the people. It was pursued by the Trump administration to set this precedent. So it is disappointing to us that the Biden administration is continuing this prosecution when we have this DOJ policy saying that they're not going to prosecute journalists, but they're allowing this Trump-era indictment and prosecution to continue, despite concerns being raised not just universally by free speech groups in the mainstream media, but now by the Australian government. I'm a fellow Australian citizen, as Julian Assange is. I have been working with the Australian members of Parliament for over a decade, trying to get this case raised. The Australian government is now on side. Our Prime Minister has said it's a priority. He has raised it with President Biden in meetings. We've had a parliamentary resolution in Australia in past weeks. 2/3 of our Parliament voted for the US and to call on the US and the UK to allow Julian Assange to come home. So this is also now becoming a test of the Australia-US special relationship. Australia bends over backwards to support the United States, and if we can't ask for the return of this citizen, in a situation where dropping the case would be protecting your own constitution, I just find it astonishing.
And for folks who aren't familiar with the US-Australia relationship, Australia joined the US in both the Vietnam and Iraq wars, probably over the objection of many of its own people, and probably over the objections of people in this room. It also hosts the Pine Gap spy base, which is a extremely important intelligence base, but also very controversial within Australia. So when Jen says they bent over backwards, she's underselling it somewhat. So for us to look at the Australians when they've done all this for us and are unable to even give back their citizen, it is causing a diplomatic rift, I think. And I have heard members of the Australian Parliament and past governments express that sentiment on this Hill. Agnes, I want to return to you, since no offense to anyone else, I think Amnesty International is probably the most prestigious human rights organization in the world. When people think human rights, if they were doing like a Freudian free association, Amnesty International would probably come to mind. Your organization has opposed this prosecution. Could you tell this room why Amnesty does?
Thank you. I think all the reasons have been already laid out, so let me just summarize it. I mean, we oppose it because it violates human rights, it violates the rights of Julian Assange, it violates his right to freedom of expression, it violates the right of the public to know, it violates freedom of information. We believe that it is politically motivated. It violates our capacity to investigate and to get accountability for war crimes. Because of the circumstances of his detention, it violates Julian Assange's right not to be tortured, right not to be under ill treatment. There has been repeated evidence of his the impact of his detention over his mental health. We are certainly opposing his extradition because we don't believe that he will receive a fair trial, so it also violates the right to a fair trial. We're very concerned about the conditions of his detention if he is extradited. We are very concerned about the use of solitary confinement for extended period of time, which would amount to torture. Whew, I don't know. We try to see that. We are not worried about. At heart, it's also about the double standard, the demands that the U.S. government is asking of other governments when some of their journalists or American journalists are being detained under very similar circumstances, and their inability to see the impact that this the detention or the demand for extradition and the charges against Julian Assange poses on the moral leadership of the United States. So, from a human rights standpoint, from a political standpoint with the relationship with Australia, from a moral leadership standpoint, it does not, it's just a disaster to continue in that direction. And we too are calling on the Biden administration to do the right thing.
So my next question, and I have, I think, two more before I open the floor up, is for any panelist who wants to take it, and it's, what is the Espionage Act? Julian Assange is facing 17 charges under the Espionage Act of 1917. What is this law, and why is it so problematic? Well, I guess I'm presupposing you find it problematic, but I think that's a good presupposition.
I'm happy to. I think the Espionage Act is an antiquated piece of legislation that was never intended to apply to journalists and publishers. If you look at the drafting history of this legislation, it was implemented in the context of the First World War, designed to, like the title of the Act, to address espionage and to criminalise espionage, not journalism. And there were debates at the time about, and it was explicitly decided to exclude languages about journalists and publishers because it wasn't supposed to apply in this way. And this, we see through the legislative history of this act, but back in 1950, the same concerns being raised. This is not supposed to apply to journalism. So we had expert evidence in the extradition challenge in the United Kingdom from a whole range of expert First Amendment scholars who made very clear that this is crossing a new legal threshold. This is never what the Act was intended for. And the problem is there is no public interest defence in the Espionage Act. So it doesn't matter that you've revealed wrongdoing or state criminality. You can still be prosecuted. And that's incredibly problematic. So it should never be applying to journalists. There's no public interest defence. And I mean, historically, we've never seen the prosecution of a publisher. So this is setting it is crossing a legal threshold. And in fact, until the Obama administration, we barely saw it used against whistleblowers, and we're seeing an increased use of the Espionage Act against whistleblowers. And I think it's incredibly problematic that a modern democracy like the United States is weaponizing an antiquated piece of legislation in this way to go after journalism.
Jody, would you like to?
No, well, the only thing I would add is there have been multiple calls for reform of this Act, and ongoing calls for reform of this Act. And one of the things I think that's very important as part of this discussion is to get change to the Espionage Act. But ultimately, that isn't going to be the thing that frees Julian Assange. And yes, it's a problematic piece of legislation, and there have been some fantastic recent analyses of the way in which it needs to be reformed. I think that's something that we can do and should think about in parallel, in particular because of the way it's being weaponized in a way that it was never intended to be used. But I want people to be clear that that's not the way that we are going to get these charges dropped and Assange freed.
Agnes, do you have any thoughts on the Espionage Act? Or?
I think my colleagues have said it all. It's part and parcel, the way it's being used is part and parcel, I think, of the securitization of governance, of government, of our society. It's part and parcel of how counterterrorism has become the thread through which violations are being justified. Of the enormous kind, could include even genocide. So, it's a reflection of the world we live in, not that it exists, because all governments kind of have one, but how it is being used and how its use is being justified.
And before I go to the next question, I will just say that Defending Rights in Dissent has worked with Representative Rashida Tlaib's office on a number of reform proposals. If people are interested in those, see me after the panel. I'm happy to talk about them at great length. I could talk about the Espionage Act for 5 hours, and Andrew is laughing in the background.
For 2 years.
Because we have been talking about it for 2 years, yes. Jen, what is the current state of Julian's extradition and case?
So we've just been in court this past week in the UK in what could be Julian's final appeal against US extradition. We sought permission to appeal. You don't have appeal as of right in the UK. The brief history of the case is we won the case back in early 2021 on the grounds of Julian's mental health picture and the oppressive prison conditions he would face in the United States. The magistrate ruled that it would be oppressive to extradite him under Section 91 of the Extradition Act because of the expert medical evidence that showed his depressive illness because of the decade-long persecution he suffered, his autistic diagnosis, and the fact to be placed under special administrative measures in the United States would cause him to commit suicide. The US then offered a conditional assurance, which Amnesty International says is not worth the paper it's written on, and the Home Secretary decided to extradite him on that basis. We sought to appeal that decision, and against the grounds that we lost, it was refused at the end of last year. We've renewed our application, that was heard this week, and we're waiting to hear from court whether we'll get it. If we're unsuccessful, the Home Secretary will extradite him to the United States. The only remaining avenue of appeal for us is to apply to the European Court of Human Rights. We will seek provisional measures to prevent him from being extradited and seek to have the European Court rule on his case. We believe we have a strong case. We have a strong case on free speech, on fair trial, on the treatment that he'll suffer if he's returned to this country, if he's extradited to this country. But it remains to be seen what happens. It's not the European Court. Provisional measures are an exceptional measure, and it's not a given. So we could be in a world where Julian Assange is extradited to the United States in the coming months.
So my final question for the panel, then I'm going to take questions from congressional staff, is what do you want the people in this room to do? They've heard all this information. They've heard about the significance of these revelations. They've heard about the press freedom aspects of Assange's extradition. They've heard he will face solitary and cruel treatment in this country. What you have a room full of congressional staffers. What do you want them to do?
Well, we need to make sure that the congressmen advocate, lobby the DOJ to drop all charges against Julian, to drop the extradition request. We need them to lobby the DOJ to lobby it. Keeping, of course, in mind the independence of the judiciary, we need them to send very strong message that the continuing detention in the United Kingdom under politically motivated charges is unacceptable, that the extradition is unacceptable. They should ensure through various means that Julian is released from the UK from the UK prison, among other things. I'm leaving the other recommendations to my colleagues.
Jody, what do you want them to do?
I would like people to go back and make clear that this case is about the First Amendment and the freedom of the press, and it's absolutely vital to that continued freedom, and that message needs to be made very clearly to the Biden administration and to the Department of Justice. It's interesting to me, having worked with Jen on this case in the UK and the US, how differently I think it is viewed here. I think there's a sense that it's something far away and distant and isn't really a matter for the US, even though this is a US case. It's absolutely the US's case. This isn't really about the UK courts. Of course, we would like the UK to drop their decision to extradite, but this is ultimately a case brought by the United States and pursued by the United States administration. It is a US issue, it is a US problem, and it needs to be fixed and solved by the US. And believe you and me, if Julian comes, this will be the most dominant case that you have to deal with for years and years to come. Julian has been now in some sort of confinement for 10 years, I think.
Okay.
12 years. Including in a maximum security prison in the UK, and I think Jen can talk a little bit more, but very little ability to move about, very little freedom, very little large periods of time in solitary confinement. This is an individual who deserves to be free, who should not be being punished. And it's high time, I think, that the US took this case seriously.
And Jen?
Well, as a lawyer, we've been calling on the Biden administration to drop this case. We've been calling on the US to drop this case for many years. We've been warning about its implications since 2010 when the Obama administration opened the grand jury investigation. All of that, everything we warned of, as Chip mentioned, has come to fruition. And we are really at the sharp end of this case. We could be in a world where Julian Assange is here on trial in the Eastern District under the Espionage Act in this country this year. That is a terrifying precedent for all of you and for the First Amendment, not just for what it means for him. So I would just urge you to try to educate people about what this case actually is about. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what he is actually charged with, what the case is really about, and it's important that people remember, because once he's here, it's going to be too late.
Thank you. I'm going to go to questions, but before I do, I want to note that Jen has made herself available for one-on-one briefings, and Gabriel Shipton, the brother of Julian Assange, will be arriving in DC later this week, and will also be meeting with offices and is available for one-on-one briefings, as is Defending Rights and Dissent. If you're interested, as is Jody, okay. So if you're interested in hearing from any of us, come up and talk to any one of us. I can put you in touch with Jen or Gabe, or talk to my colleague in the back, Sue Udry, who's wearing blue. She can also send you in the right direction. We're going to open the floor for questions. I know we have both staff and activists here. We want to give staff the chance to ask the questions first. So if you're a congressional staffer and you have a question, please raise your hand, but not all at once. Andrew, you have a question.
I did ask, but I don't want to go over other people. I've got two questions. The first being, how far do you all think the Australian government is willing to go to pressure the US government? Because frankly, I think right now it's seen as they're talking about it, but they're not actually going to impose any consequences. And then my second question is kind of the one that the staff in this room are going to hear from their bosses, which is that, isn't this the guy that did the DNC leaks? And so, for a lot of Democrats, there's a feeling of why should we help and why is this important? So I'd like to give you all the opportunity to engage with that particular line of attack and push back against it as I think you can.
Anyone want to start with this?
I'm very happy to.
I knew you would be.
First, on the DNC leaks question. It is so important to remember that was a leak that was published by WikiLeaks in the context of an election. The DNC, in fact, sued WikiLeaks over that leak, and the judge found that that publication had the highest possible protection of the First Amendment precisely because it was a leak about a political party in the context of an election. There couldn't be a higher public interest and more press freedom concerns that are raised by it. So whether or not it suits your politics or not, it is absolutely protected speech and ruled to be protected speech by the courts of this country. Now, you might not like the politics of any particular leak, but that's not really the point. The point is, was it protected speech? And it absolutely was protected publication and protected speech. So even the New York Times, I mean, it's worth looking at what Dean Baquet has said about it. If they'd received that material, they would have published it. He said it was absolutely newsworthy and we would have published it had we received it. And indeed, other publications did publish similar material. So I think it's really important that we make that point forcefully. And as WikiLeaks said at the time, had they received Donald Trump's tax information, they would have published that too. So it's not a question. WikiLeaks doesn't decide what information is provided to them. They receive information and publish it, and if it's newsworthy and in the public interest, and they can verify the information, they will publish. And that leak in particular, that publication in particular, the highest form of protection under the First Amendment. In relation to the question about Australia, that is a great question and one for the Australian government. We know that the Australian government is raising the case and at the highest levels. I am working with the Australian government to try to seek a resolution, and the question is, what will it take? I'm not a politician, I'm a lawyer, so that's a question for the Australian government and for the US government. But in my view, when you've got the Australian Prime Minister saying this is a priority, when you've got Australia's Parliament saying that they want him to come home, the US ought to be listening to the Australian government, people and its Parliament as an ally of the United States.
Anyone else want to take one of those two questions? I would just also note that Robert Mueller similarly investigated the DNC stuff and concluded, like the judge did, there was no way to prosecute them under the First Amendment, and that of the information Assange is charged with releasing, the DNC leaks are not part of it. It is exclusively the 2010-2011 revelations we've been talking about. So he is both being prosecuted for the leaks that everyone but the Pentagon thinks are really great, and B, both a judge and Mueller have found that conduct to be protected by the First Amendment. So it is purely not part of these charges. And I also believe they leaked Sarah Palin's emails at one point too. Is that not true? And yet we never hear about that.
WikiLeaks has released material across the political spectrum, so this is not... They've revealed evidence of spying of different countries, they've released the Syria files, so it's not just about the United States, and it's not just a particular political side of politics. WikiLeaks releases what they receive if it's newsworthy and in the public interest, and we've seen them release incredible publications on a range of different governments and a range of different political groups.
So I would say two things if you're asked about that. One is, as Chip said, it's not part of these charges. It's not relevant to this case. And if we keep doing this whataboutery that has happened time and time again in this case, I think we're doing ourselves a great disservice, and we risk, I think, sleepwalking in to an extremely dangerous situation for free speech because people have decided that they don't like Julian Assange, or they're worried about the DNC. It's not that, like, this case isn't about that. It's about the First Amendment and a free press. And free press is not a partisan issue, nor can it be. And as we go into what could be the most important election ever in the United States, it is really, really important that members of Congress come out very forcefully in defense of a free press, because you will miss it when it's gone.
Any other questions from the audience? Over there.
I just wondered if you could repeat the name of the Turkish journalist you had mentioned.
Candundar, it's Candundar.
And Defending Rights and Dissent called attention to his case at the time, even though we're not an international organization, because they were citing the sorts of behaviors that we were criticizing the DOJ for as precedent.
And Can now lives in exile in Germany. And he's a wonderful journalist who's spoken out forcefully in support of Julian because of his own personal experience.
Any other questions? Kathy.
Hi. We're sitting here today after a young Air Force enlistee.
We keep the questions about
It is about Assange.
Okay.
So he immolated himself outside the Israeli embassy, saying he did not want to be complicit in genocide. Were there releases in WikiLeaks of information of illegal activity of the Israelis that might have helped form his conscience that led him to this great personal sacrifice?
I don't think anyone can speculate on whether
No, I'm not asking you to
Wiki-
speculate. I'm just saying, was there information in WikiLeaks published about Israel's illegal activity?
There's a huge amount of WikiLeaks released the diplomatic cables, for example, covered every country in the world and were published in partnership with not just the first big 5 newspapers that covered the world's major languages, but with hundreds of media partners around the world, including in Israel. I think in the context of the current climate, there's WikiLeaks material that talks about the sort of Israel's history of backing Hamas, actually. So there's some really interesting historical reflections on current events from that historic material about Israel and the current crisis.
Any other questions, especially those from staff? I'd love to hear from staff, because you all are the ones who will make the decisions, or your bosses will, but you will advise them. So not see any more staff questions. Ford, I'm going to let you ask a question.
Sure. To any of you on the panel, are you concerned that if Assange is extradited, that they could add any additional charges once he's here in the United States, or is there anything precluding that from happening?
It's a really good question, and that's part of our extradition appeal. So I haven't outlined, I'm happy to if people are interested in all of our grounds of appeal. One of them was that if Julian is extradited to the United States, there's nothing preventing the US bringing new charges against him. And there was an exchange in court, which I think was quite revealing, where one of our arguments is that if he was extradited on the facts that are pleaded in the indictment, he could be exposed to new charges that would attract the death penalty. And there was an exchange in court where the judge was asking US counsel, well, could he be exposed to the death penalty once in the United States? And the answer was yes. Is there any protection against it? No. And is there any assurance from the United States that he will not face the death penalty? And the answer is also no. So this forms part of our appeal in the UK, because of course the UK would not extradite to the death penalty or the risk of the death penalty.
And I was also in court when that exchange was made, and it was very jarring to hear. I was surprised by the prosecution's response to that question. Any other responses to the new charges question? Okay, any other questions from anyone? Martha?
Yes, there's a House resolution on freedom of the press and dropping the charges against Assange. It's bipartisan. Is that something that would be useful for us to concentrate and try and get more people? There's not too many people, representatives that are signed on, but it's, since we're in the House, what do anybody think about making that a priority?
I think it's definitely a useful organizing tool. I think that a number of the people who have signed on to it are the people who have already signed the letters to Biden and Garland. But I do think it's a useful organizing tool, and I do believe that is the subject of Gage Shipton's visit coming up later this week. So if your boss is not on this resolution, I would encourage them to get on it. If your boss wants to speak out for Julian Assange, but for some reason this resolution isn't to their liking, I would encourage them to make a public statement, especially on social media, calling for the charges to be dropped. And if your boss is not satisfied with the resolution, the past 2 letters, I'll even offer to help them write a 3rd letter, because we've sent 3 NGO letters, why not 3 congressional letters as well? Any other thoughts on the resolution, or?
Well, I would just urge your members to support it. We've had a resolution calling for it from the Australian Parliament. He's an Australian citizen, and this case is important. And it's not just about Julian, this is about your rights and about your First Amendment.
Yeah, and my understanding is that that's one of the reasons that Julian's brother Gabriel is going to be here for the next 2 weeks, and I would really urge you to take that opportunity to meet with him and understand a little more about the case. I'm confident that when people get past what has been a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about this case, it's fairly simple actually. and therefore hopefully not only can you persuade your own members and representatives to sign that, but also encourage others to do the same. And I think once we get that momentum, I feel that will start to send the kind of message that we need to be being sent to the administration.
Agnes, do you have any thoughts on this? Okay, last call for questions from staff. Okay.
So if it's necessary, what's the probability that the European Court of Human Rights would take the case, and what would that process look like?
Repeat.
What is the probability that the European Court of Human Rights will take the case, and what does the process look like?
Once there's a decision from the court, if it is to refuse permission, we would have 28 days to apply to the European Court. If we were granted provisional measures, that the UK would then be obliged not to extradite him until a ruling was possible. And to give you a sense of how exceptional the measure is, in the last year there were 63 provisional measures applications in cases involving deportation or extradition, and they were granted in one case. So it is an exceptional measure. We believe we have a strong case, but it's not a given. And so there is a very real prospect that he could be extradited to the United States soon.
Is there any concern that the UK could try to sneak him on a plane before the European courts could intervene, or is that just needless fear-mongering?
The UK is bound by the European Court of Human Rights, has international obligations to comply with decisions of the European Court of Human Rights.
Okay. Does anybody else want to take the European Court question?
No, I was just going to add, just one example of such measures was when Alexei Navalny had been poisoned and was lying in Siberia. The European Court did come up with precautionary measures for his so that he could be released to Germany. I think it's as serious a case. So I'm hoping that they could come up with some strong measures.
I know I've said this before, but this time I mean it. This is the last call for questions from members. I mean it this time, so don't tempt me.
I think just one more point about the European Court. If we are given provisional measures, it will be a pretty public sanctioning of the United States and what the United States is doing in this case. So I think politically, and thinking about how the United States is represented, the European Court proceedings could be a pretty serious indictment on what the United States is doing.
Any final staff questions? Do any panelists have any final thoughts they want to convey? Okay, I'm going to thank everyone for coming. I'm going to thank the Office of McGovern for giving us this nice room. For people who are watching online, we are at capacity here. As far as I know, this is the first in-person briefing on the Assange case on the Hill since the indictment was unsealed. And we are at this historic briefing, and it is a full room. Jen, Jody, and I are all available to talk to people one-on-one, or as a group even. And Gabriel Shipton, Julian's brother, is coming on Friday. If anybody wants to meet with him, come up to me, and I'll pass his information on. I'll pass your information on to him, not his information on to you. Thank you so much.